The sweat ran down Garrett Hayes's back in rivers as he hoisted the 50th sack of grain onto his shoulder that morning, the burlap rough against his neck as he carried it from the wagon into the dusty storehouse at the edge of town. It was June 1876 in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly on everything below, turning the earth to powder and the air to fire. Garrett had been working since dawn, his muscles straining with each 50-pound load. But he never complained. A man did what needed doing, and after spending 5 years in these mountains trapping and hunting, his body had become a machine built for hard labor. At 28 years old, Garrett stood well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. His dark brown hair fell past his collar, sun-streaked and wild, framing a face weathered by wind and sun, but still young enough to be handsome. His arms were thick with muscle, his chest solid as oak, and his hands were calloused from years of work that would have broken lesser men. He wore simple clothes, a worn cotton shirt rolled up to his elbows, and canvas pants tucked into heavy boots, but even these plain garments could not hide the raw strength of his frame. "That's the last of them," called out Samuel Thornton, the general store owner who had hired Garrett for the morning's work. "I appreciate the help, Hayes. Those grain shipments get heavier every year, or maybe I'm just getting older." Garrett wiped his brow with the back of his hand and nodded, accepting the coins Samuel pressed into his palm. The money would buy supplies for another month in his cabin up in the mountains, where he lived alone with only the pine trees and wildlife for company. He had come down from the high country 3 days ago with a load of beaver pelts to trade, and he had been lingering in town longer than usual, though he could not quite say why. "You staying for the dance tonight?" Samuel asked, counting out bills at his desk. "Whole town will be there. Might do you some good to socialize, seeing as you spend most of your time talking to trees and bears." Garrett almost smiled. "Almost. Do not think dancing is for me. Suit yourself, but there will be food and music, and plenty of young ladies who would not mind meeting a strong fellow like you." Before Garrett could respond, the door to the general store burst open with such force that the bell above it rang violently. A woman stumbled inside, her face flushed and her chest heaving as though she had been running. Her dress was covered in dust from the road, and her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that caught Garrett's attention. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and blue mixed together, and they were filled with desperate fear. "Please," she gasped, gripping the doorframe for support. "Please, I need help. He is coming. I need somewhere to hide." Samuel hurried forward, his face creased with concern. "Miss, what is wrong? Who is coming?" "My husband," she said, and the word came out like a curse. "My former husband. He followed me from Virginia City. He's going to kill me this time. I know he will." Garrett felt something shift inside his chest, some protective instinct that he had not felt in years. He moved forward without thinking, placing himself between the woman and the door. "How far behind you is he?" She looked up at Garrett, and for a moment her fear seemed to lessen, as though his sheer size and presence offered some promise of safety. "Maybe 10 minutes. I stole a horse and rode as hard as I could, but he was coming after me. He always comes after me." Samuel wrung his hands nervously. "We should get the sheriff. Tobias will know what to do." "There is no time," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Please, I just need somewhere to hide. Just until he passes through town." Garrett made his decision in an instant. "Come with me." He did not wait for her to argue. He simply took her by the arm, gently but firmly, and led her toward the back door of the general store. Samuel called after them, something about being careful, but Garrett was already moving. His mind worked quickly, calculating distances and possibilities. His horse was tied up behind the building, a big gray gelding named Smoke, who could carry 2 riders without trouble. The quickest way out of town was east, through the narrow canyon that led up into the foothills where his cabin sat hidden among the pines. "What is your name?" he asked as they emerged into the bright sunlight behind the store. "Clara," she said, nearly tripping over her skirts as she tried to keep up with his long strides. "Clara Hendricks, or it was Hendricks. I do not even know what my name is anymore." "Clara," Garrett repeated, and he liked the way it sounded. "I am Garrett Hayes. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, but you need to trust me. Can you do that?" She nodded, her eyes searching his face as though trying to determine if he was another kind of danger. But whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because when he lifted her onto Smoke's back without warning, she did not scream or fight. She simply held on tight as Garrett swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. "Hold on," he said, and then he kicked Smoke into a gallop. They thundered out of town, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Garrett did not look back. He could hear shouting behind them, angry male voices calling out, but he focused only on the path ahead. The canyon opened up before them like a mouth, steep rock walls on either side, and Smoke's hooves clattered against the stones as they climbed higher and higher. Clara pressed back against Garrett's chest, her body rigid with tension, but she did not cry out or ask him to slow down. Garrett could feel every breath she took, every tremor that ran through her slender frame. She was small compared to him, delicate even, though he sensed there was steel beneath her frightened exterior. No woman who had run from an abusive husband and ridden alone across the Montana Territory was truly fragile. She had survived, and that took a special kind of strength. They rode for more than an hour, climbing steadily into the mountains until the air grew cooler and the smell of pine replaced the dust of the valley. Garrett finally slowed Smoke to a walk when they reached a narrow trail that wound through dense forest. The cabin was close now, just another mile or so, hidden in a clearing where few people ever ventured. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Clara nodded, though she still had not released her death grip on his forearm. "Yes, thank you. I do not even know you, and you are risking yourself for me." "No one should have to run in fear," Garrett said simply. "And no man should raise his hand to a woman. That is not what men do." He felt her relax slightly against him, and something warm spread through his chest. He told himself it was just satisfaction at helping someone in need, but he knew it was more than that. From the moment Clara had stumbled into that store with fear in her eyes, something had awakened in him, something he had thought long dead. The cabin appeared through the trees, a solid structure of logs and stone that Garrett had built with his own hands 3 years ago. It was not fancy, but it was sturdy and well made, with a stone chimney at one end and glass windows that he had hauled up from town at great expense. A small barn stood nearby, large enough for Smoke and the few supplies Garrett kept on hand. He dismounted first and then lifted Clara down, his hands spanning her waist easily. She stumbled when her feet hit the ground, her legs stiff from the hard ride, and Garrett steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "This is your home?" she asked, looking around the clearing with wide eyes. "For now," Garrett said. He led Smoke toward the barn, and Clara followed, seeming unsure what else to do. "I move around some, following the trapping seasons, but I come back here when I need to." "It is beautiful," Clara said softly, and Garrett glanced at her in surprise. Most people saw his cabin as rough and isolated, a place to avoid rather than admire. But Clara was looking at the mountains rising up behind the clearing, at the wildflowers growing in patches of sunlight, at the creek that bubbled over rocks just beyond the trees. "It is so peaceful." "It is safe," Garrett said, which was what mattered most right now. He unsaddled Smoke and rubbed the horse down quickly, then led Clara toward the cabin. "You can stay here as long as you need to. Your husband will not find you here." Clara stopped at the threshold, her hand on the doorframe. "Former husband," she corrected, her voice quiet but firm. "I left him 6 months ago in Virginia City, filed for divorce on the grounds of cruelty. The judge granted it, but Thomas refused to accept it. He said I belonged to him, that no piece of paper would change that." Garrett felt anger rise in his chest, hot and fierce. He had seen men like that before, men who believed they owned everything they touched, including other human beings. "He is wrong. You do not belong to anyone but yourself." Clara looked up at him, and for the first time since she had burst into the general store, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it transformed her face. She was beautiful, Garrett realized, though he suspected she had no idea. Her features were delicate but strong, her eyes sharp with intelligence, and there was something about the way she held herself, even frightened and exhausted, that spoke of dignity and courage. "Thank you," she said again. "You do not even know me, and yet you are being kinder than anyone has been in years." Garrett opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "You are welcome here, Clara." For as long as you need." The inside of the cabin was simple but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a kitchen area nearby, complete with a cast-iron stove and a rough-hewn table. A bed stood in one corner, covered with thick quilts and furs, and shelves lined with books and supplies took up most of the remaining wall space. It was a bachelor's home, practical and unadorned, but it was warm and dry and far from the violence that had chased Clara across the territory. "You have books," Clara said in surprise, moving toward the shelves as though drawn by a magnet. Her fingers traced the spines lovingly. "Shakespeare, Dickens, Walt Whitman. I did not expect to find a library in a mountain cabin." "A man's body is not the only thing that needs feeding," Garrett said. He moved to the stove and began building a fire, his movements efficient and practiced. "My mother taught me to read when I was young. She said ignorance was the worst kind of poverty." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Garrett said, and the past tense hung heavy in the air. He did not elaborate, and Clara was perceptive enough not to press. Instead, she sank into one of the chairs by the table, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. "When did you last eat?" Garrett asked, studying her pale face. "Yesterday morning, I think. I do not remember." Garrett nodded and set about preparing food. He had venison from a deer he had shot 2 days ago, and he sliced it thin and set it to cook in a pan with some wild onions he had gathered. There was bread, too, only a day old and fresh water from the creek. It was simple fare, but it was wholesome and filling, and he could see Clara's eyes following his movements hungrily. They did not speak much as he cooked, but the silence was not uncomfortable. Garrett found himself hyper-aware of Clara's presence, of the way she sat with her spine straight despite her exhaustion, of the way her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. He wanted to ask her 100 questions: where she had come from originally, how she had ended up married to a man like Thomas Hendricks, what her plans were now that she was free. But he sensed that pushing too hard would only frighten her, so he kept quiet and focused on the food. When he finally set a plate in front of her, Clara looked up at him with such gratitude that it made his chest ache. "You are very kind, Garrett Hayes." "Just doing what is right," he said, though even to his own ears it sounded insufficient. He sat across from her with his own plate and watched as she took her first bite. She closed her eyes, savoring the food as though it were a feast instead of a simple mountain meal, and Garrett felt that protective instinct surge again, stronger than before. He would keep her safe. Whatever it took, whoever came looking for her, Garrett would stand between Clara and the violence that hunted her. It was not just duty or decency. It was something deeper, something he did not yet have words for. Clara ate slowly, as though her stomach had forgotten how to process food, and between bites she began to talk. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, as though a dam had broken inside her. She told Garrett about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had died when she was 16. Her mother had followed him into the grave a year later, leaving Clara alone in the world. She had worked as a seamstress for a time, barely scraping by, until Thomas Hendricks had come into the shop one day. "He seemed so respectable," Clara said, staring down at her plate. "He was a lawyer, well-dressed and well-spoken. He courted me properly, brought me flowers, told me I was beautiful. I was 19 and stupid and alone, and I believed every word." Garrett said nothing, just listened, his jaw tight. "We married within 3 months. He convinced me to move west with him, said there were opportunities in the mining towns. And at first it was fine. He worked, I kept house, and we seemed happy. But then he started drinking. And when he drank, he became someone else, someone cruel." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The first time he hit me, he cried afterward and begged for forgiveness, said it would never happen again, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. But it did happen again, and again, and each time it got worse." Garrett's hands clenched into fists on the table, but he kept his voice level. "How did you get away?" "There was a woman in Virginia City, Mrs. Patterson. She ran a boarding house and she saw the bruises. She told me about a lawyer who would help women like me, who would file divorce papers without charging too much. It took me months to save enough money without Thomas noticing. I hid coins in my sewing basket, claimed I needed extra fabric when really I was selling things piece by piece. Finally, I had enough. I filed the papers and Mrs. Patterson helped me move into her boarding house while I waited for the judge's decision. And the judge granted the divorce? Clara nodded. He did. Thomas was furious. He came to the boarding house and tried to drag me out, but Mrs. Patterson had her sons there and they stopped him. He swore he would find me, that I could not hide forever. So I left Virginia City. I've been moving from town to town ever since, working where I can, trying to stay ahead of him. But he keeps finding me. He found me in Helena. He found me in Butte. And now he has found me in Silver Creek. He will not find you here, Garrett said firmly. This cabin is too remote, too hidden. And even if he does somehow track you here, he will have to go through me. Clara met his eyes, and he saw something shift in her expression, some of the fear giving way to hope. Why are you doing this? You could have just let me hide in the store and gone on your way. Why bring me all the way up here? Garrett considered the question carefully. He was not a man given to impulsive decisions or sentimental gestures. He had spent the last 5 years building a life of solitude and self-sufficiency, avoiding entanglements of any kind. But something about Clara had reached past all his carefully constructed walls. Because when I looked at you, I saw someone who needed help, he said finally. And I am not the kind of man who walks away from that. My father was a cruel man, hard with his fists and harder with his words. My mother bore it for years before he finally drank himself to death. I was 14 when he died, and I swore then that I would never be like him, and I would never stand by while someone like him hurt someone weaker. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I'm sorry about your mother. She lived 10 more years after he died, Garrett said. Good years, mostly. She remarried eventually, a kind man who treated her the way she deserved. She died of fever when I was 24. That is when I came out here to the mountains. You were running too, Clara said softly. Maybe, Garrett admitted. Or maybe I was just looking for somewhere I could breathe. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and afterward, Garrett showed Clara where everything was in the cabin. He gave her fresh water to wash with and one of his clean shirts to sleep in, since she had no other clothes. She protested at first, saying she did not want to put him out, but he waved away her concerns. You take the bed, he said. I will sleep by the fire. I cannot take your bed, Clara argued. You have already done so much. You can and you will, Garrett said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You need real rest, and that bed is more comfortable than the floor. I have slept in worse places. Clara looked like she wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was written in every line of her body. Finally, she nodded and moved toward the bed, her steps slow and careful. Garrett turned away to give her privacy as she changed into his shirt, and when he looked back, she was already under the quilts, her eyes half closed. Garrett, she said, her voice drowsy. Yes? Thank you for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you. You do not owe me anything, Garrett said. He settled onto the floor near the fireplace, wrapping himself in a thick blanket. Just rest now. You are safe here. Within minutes, he could hear her breathing deepen and slow as sleep claimed her. Garrett lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the cabin. The fire crackled softly, the wind whispered through the pines outside, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. But louder than all of that was the sound of Clara's peaceful breathing, and Garrett realized with a start that he had not felt this content in years. He told himself it was just the satisfaction of helping someone in need. He told himself it meant nothing more than that. But deep down, in a place he was not quite ready to examine, he knew it was a lie. The next morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and painting everything in shades of gold. Garrett woke early, as he always did, and moved quietly so as not to disturb Clara. She was still asleep in the bed, her dark blonde hair spread across the pillow like silk, one hand curled beneath her cheek. She looked younger in sleep, the worry lines smoothed from her face, and Garrett found himself staring longer than was probably appropriate. He shook his head and moved outside, taking smoke from the barn and leading him down to the creek for water. The morning air was cool and crisp, smelling of pine and wildflowers, and Garrett took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs. He had always loved this time of day, when the world was quiet and still before the heat of the afternoon set in. He was just leading Smoke back to the barn when he heard the cabin door open. Clara emerged, still wearing his shirt, though she had put her dress back on over it for modesty. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, uncombed but beautiful in its wildness, and she looked around the clearing with wonder. "Good morning," Garrett said, securing smoke in his stall. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted. She walked toward him slowly, her bare feet careful on the rough ground. "I forgot what it feels like to not be afraid." "You do not need to be afraid here," Garrett said. He gestured toward the creek. "There is fresh water if you want to wash, and I was about to make breakfast." They fell into an easy routine that morning, working together in the cabin as though they had been doing it for years. Clara proved to be a capable cook, taking over the preparation of breakfast while Garrett brought in more firewood and checked his traps. They ate together at the table, talking about small things. Clara asked about the mountains, about the animals and plants that grew there, and Garrett found himself telling her stories about his life as a trapper, about the brutal winters and the brief, glorious summers, about the bear he had fought off 2 years ago and the eagle he sometimes saw circling above the cabin. "It sounds like a hard life," Clara said, cupping her hands around her mug of coffee. It is," Garrett agreed, "but it is honest work, and I answer to no one but myself. That is worth something." "It is worth everything," Clara said with feeling. "I spent 3 years answering to someone else, letting him control every aspect of my life. I would rather live in a one-room shack and eat nothing but beans than go back to that." Garrett studied her across the table, seeing the steel in her spine and the determination in her eyes. "You will not have to go back. I promise you that." Clara smiled, and again Garrett was struck by how it transformed her face. "You make me believe it might actually be true." They spent the rest of the day settling into an unexpected domesticity. Clara insisted on helping around the cabin, mending a tear in Garrett's spare shirt and organizing the somewhat chaotic food supplies. Garrett split more firewood and repaired a weak board in the barn wall, though he found himself making excuses to return to the cabin every hour or so, just to check on Clara. She was always there, humming softly to herself as she worked, and each time Garrett saw her, he felt that same warm glow in his chest. It was dangerous, he knew. Clara was vulnerable and traumatized, and the last thing she needed was another man trying to claim her. But Garrett could not seem to help the way his eyes followed her, or the way his pulse quickened when she smiled at him. That evening, after they had eaten dinner and cleaned up together, Clara asked if she could read one of his books. Garrett gestured toward the shelves and told her to take whatever she liked. She chose a volume of poetry, Emily Dickinson, and settled into the chair by the fire while Garrett sat at the table cleaning his hunting rifle. "I used to love to read," Clara said softly, her eyes on the pages. "But Thomas said it was a waste of time. He said I should be focused on keeping house and being a proper wife. He burned my books once, after I had spent too long reading and dinner was late." Garrett's hand stilled on the rifle. "He sounds like a fool as well as a brute." "He was both," Clara agreed. "I think that is why I stayed as long as I did. He convinced me that I was the problem, that if I had just tried harder to be what he wanted, everything would be fine. It took me a long time to realize that nothing I did would ever be enough, because the problem was not me. It was him." "You are not the problem," Garrett said firmly, setting down the rifle and looking at her directly. "You are smart and strong and brave. Any man would be lucky to have you in his life, and any man who does not see that is blind." Clara's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at the book in her lap. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Garrett said. "I know you left everything familiar to escape a bad situation. I know you kept running even when you were exhausted and terrified. I know you saved up money in secret and filed for divorce in a time when most women would not dare. Those things tell me everything I need to know about your character." Clara looked up at him, her gray-blue eyes shining in the firelight. "You are a good man, Garrett Hayes. Better than you probably realize." Garrett did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded and went back to cleaning his rifle. But he felt Clara's gaze on him for a long moment before she returned to her book, and the cabin felt warmer somehow, more alive than it had in the 3 years since he had built it. The days began to blend together in a way that was both comfortable and disconcerting. Clara settled into life at the cabin with surprising ease, taking on the cooking and mending while Garrett hunted and trapped and kept the place running. They talked for hours each evening, sharing stories about their pasts and their dreams for the future. Garrett learned that Clara had always wanted to run her own business, perhaps a dress shop or a bakery. Clara learned that Garrett had once dreamed of being a school teacher, before his mother's death had sent him running to the mountains. "You would have been a good teacher," Clara said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. "You are patient, and you explain things clearly, and you have all these books." "Maybe someday," Garrett said, though he did not really believe it. He had built a life here in the wilderness, and he could not imagine returning to civilization. "Maybe someday," Clara echoed, and something in her tone made Garrett look at her sharply. She was staring out at the mountains, her expression wistful, and he wondered what she was thinking. A week passed, then two. Garrett knew he should ride back down to Silver Creek at some point, if only to check on whether Thomas Hendricks was still looking for Clara. But he found himself reluctant to leave the cabin, reluctant to leave Clara alone even for a day. She was thriving here, he told himself. The fear was gradually leaving her eyes, replaced by something brighter and more hopeful. She laughed more easily now, and sometimes Garrett caught her singing to herself as she worked. It was dangerous, this growing attachment. Garrett knew it. Clara was not his to keep, and once the threat from her former husband passed, she would move on with her life. She would go back to civilization, find work, maybe eventually meet someone new. Someone who could give her the life she deserved, with a proper house and neighbors and all the things Garrett's mountain cabin could never provide. But knowing all that did not stop his heart from lurching every time she smiled at him. It did not stop him from finding excuses to stand close to her, to brush against her hand when he passed her something, to watch the firelight play across her face in the evenings. And it did not stop him from lying awake at night by the fire, listening to her breathe and wishing things could be different. Clara, for her part, seemed unaware of the turmoil she was causing in Garrett's carefully ordered world. Or perhaps she was aware and was simply too kind to acknowledge it. She treated him with warmth and gratitude, but there was no hint of anything deeper in her manner. She was still healing, Garrett reminded himself, still learning to trust again. The last thing she needed was him complicating things with unwanted feelings. On the 15th day, Garrett finally forced himself to make plans to ride down to Silver Creek. They were running low on supplies, coffee and flour, and a few other necessities, and he needed to find out if it was safe for Clara to leave the mountains. He mentioned it over breakfast, keeping his tone casual, and Clara's face immediately clouded with worry. "What if he is still there?" she asked, setting down her fork. "What if he finds out where I am?" "He will not find out," Garrett assured her. "I will be careful. I will ask around quietly, find out if anyone has seen him, and I will be back before nightfall." Clara bit her lip, clearly unhappy with the plan but unable to offer an alternative. "Please be careful." "I will," Garrett promised. He wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, to offer her more concrete comfort, but he held himself back. "You will be safe here. Just stay inside, keep the door barred, and do not answer for anyone but me." "All right," Clara said, though her voice was small. Garrett rode out an hour later, his saddlebags empty and his rifle across his back. It felt wrong to leave the cabin, to leave Clara alone and unprotected, but he forced himself to keep going. The ride down the mountain took most of the morning, and by the time he reached Silver Creek, the sun was high overhead and the town was bustling with midday activity. Garrett tied Smoke up outside the general store and went inside, nodding at Samuel Thornton. The older man's face lit up when he saw Garrett. "Hayes, we were starting to wonder if you had fallen off a cliff. You have been gone for 2 weeks." "Just needed some time in the mountains," Garrett said easily. "I came down to stock up on supplies. How has business been?" Samuel launched into a detailed description of the past 2 weeks, and Garrett listened patiently, waiting for an opening to ask about Thomas Hendricks. It came sooner than expected. "Oh, and there was some excitement about 10 days ago," Samuel said, measuring out flour into a sack. "A man came through looking for a woman, his wife, he claimed. Said she had run away and he was trying to bring her home. Nasty piece of work, if you ask me. Had mean eyes." Garrett's hands tightened on the counter. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing to tell," Samuel said with a shrug. "I did not know anything about any missing wife. Sheriff Tobias talked to him, told him there had not been any strange women in town. The fellow hung around for a few days asking questions, But eventually he wrote out, "Headed east, I think." Relief flooded through Garrett's chest. "Good. That is good." Samuel gave him a knowing look. "That young lady who came running into my store, she is all right, I hope?" "She's safe," Garrett said carefully. "That is all I can say." "I figured you had something to do with her disappearance," Samuel said. "Good man. Hayes. That fellow was bad news. I could see it in his face." Garrett finished gathering his supplies and paid Samuel, then spent another hour walking around town, listening to conversations and asking casual questions. Everyone told the same story. Thomas Hendricks had come looking for his wife, had not found her, and had left town in a rage. Some people thought he had gone back to Virginia City. Others thought he had headed to Helena. But no one thought he was still in the area. Satisfied, Garrett loaded his supplies onto Smoke and began the long ride back up the mountain. His heart felt lighter than it had in days. Clara could relax now. She could stop living in fear, at least for a while. And maybe, Garrett thought with a flicker of hope he tried to suppress, maybe she would decide to stay at the cabin a little longer. Maybe she was not ready to leave yet. The sun was setting by the time Garrett reached the cabin, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He could see smoke rising from the chimney and the warm glow of lamplight in the windows. It looked like home, he thought, and then immediately shook his head at his own foolishness. It was his home, yes, but Clara was just a guest. He needed to remember that. He dismounted and led Smoke toward the barn, calling out so Clara would know it was him. The cabin door opened immediately and Clara emerged, her face bright with relief. "You're back," she said, hurrying across the clearing toward him. "I was starting to worry." "I said I would be back before nightfall," Garrett reminded her, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened at her nearness. "I keep my word." "I know," Clara said. "I know you do. Did you learn anything about Thomas?" Garrett told her what Samuel had said, watching as the tension gradually drained from her body. By the time he finished, Clara was smiling, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He is gone," she whispered. "He is really gone." "For now," Garrett cautioned, not wanting her to let her guard down too much. "But yes, he is gone. You can breathe easy for a while." Clara did something then that surprised them both. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Garrett's waist, pressing her face against his chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled by his shirt. "Thank you for everything." Garrett froze for a moment, his mind going blank. Then, slowly, he brought his arms up and wrapped them around Clara, holding her gently as though she were made of glass. She was so small against him, the top of her head barely reaching his chin, and he could feel her heart beating fast against his ribs. She smelled like wood smoke and soap and something uniquely her, and Garrett closed his eyes, letting himself have this one moment. Then Clara pulled back, her cheeks flushed, and Garrett immediately released her. "Sorry," she said, looking embarrassed. "I did not mean to be so forward." "No need to apologize," Garrett said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You have been through a lot. It is understandable to need comfort." Clara nodded, but something flickered in her eyes, something Garrett could not quite read. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, and Garrett followed, his mind spinning. That night, after dinner, they sat by the fire as they always did. But the comfortable ease that had developed between them over the past 2 weeks felt strained somehow, as though Clara's embrace had shifted something fundamental. Garrett tried to focus on the book he was reading, but he kept glancing up at Clara, who was staring into the flames with a distant expression. "Garrett?" she said finally, breaking the silence. "Yes?" "What will I do now? I cannot stay here forever, hiding from the world. But I have nowhere to go and no money for a new start." Garrett closed his book, giving her his full attention. "You can stay here as long as you need to. There's no rush for you to leave." "But I cannot live off your charity forever," Clara protested. "You have been more than generous, but it is not fair to you. You came to these mountains for solitude, and instead you got stuck with a stray woman who brought danger to your doorstep." "You are not a stray," Garrett said sharply. "And you did not bring danger. That man brought danger. You were just trying to survive." Clara shook her head. "Even so, I need to think about my future. I thought maybe I could go back to work as a seamstress, perhaps in Helena or even further west in Missoula, somewhere Thomas would not think to look." The thought of Clara leaving sent a jolt of panic through Garrett's chest. He tried to tell himself it was just concern for her safety, but he knew it was more than that. In the past 2 weeks, Clara had become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The cabin felt alive when she was in it. His days had purpose beyond mere survival. And when she smiled at him, he felt like the man he had always wanted to be. But he could not say any of that. Clara was not ready to hear it, and he had no right to burden her with his feelings when she was still healing from years of abuse. "You do not have to decide right away," Garrett said carefully. "Take your time. Figure out what you really want." "What I really want," Clara repeated softly, still staring into the fire. "I do not even know anymore. For so long, all I wanted was to be free. And now that I am, I feel lost." "You're not lost," Garrett said. "You're just finding your way. That is different." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and Garrett saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. It was not fear or gratitude or any of the things he had seen before. It was something softer, warmer, and infinitely more dangerous. "You are a very wise man, Garrett Hayes," Clara said quietly, "and a very kind one." Garrett did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But later, when they had both gone to bed, he lay awake listening to Clara breathe and wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was starting to feel the same way he did. The next few days passed in a haze of unspoken tension. Clara seemed restless, moving around the cabin with nervous energy, and Garrett found himself watching her constantly, trying to decipher what she was thinking. They still worked together, still talked in the evenings, but there was an undercurrent now, something electric and unacknowledged that crackled between them. On the 4th day after Garrett's trip to town, Clara announced that she wanted to learn to shoot. Garrett looked up from the saddle he was repairing, surprised. "You want to learn to use a gun?" "I want to be able to protect myself," Clara said firmly. "If I am going to make a life out here, whether in town or somewhere else, I need to know how to defend myself. I never want to feel helpless again." Garrett considered this. On one hand, he liked the idea of Clara being able to protect herself. On the other hand, teaching her to shoot meant standing close to her, touching her, and he was not sure his self-control could handle that. But he could see the determination in her eyes, and he knew better than to argue with a woman who had made up her mind. "All right," he said. "We will start this afternoon." They spent the rest of the morning setting up targets in the clearing behind the cabin, tin cans balanced on logs at various distances. Garrett brought out his smallest rifle, a .22 that would not have too much kick for a beginner, and showed Clara how to hold it properly. "The key is to breathe," he said, standing behind her and adjusting her grip on the stock. "You breathe in, let half of it out, and squeeze the trigger on the exhale. Do not jerk it, just squeeze gently." Clara nodded, her body tense with concentration. Garrett tried to focus on the lesson, but it was nearly impossible with Clara pressed back against his chest, her hair smelling of wildflowers and her shoulders fitting perfectly beneath his arms. He swallowed hard and forced himself to concentrate. "Now try it," he said, stepping back to give her space. Clara took a deep breath, aimed at the nearest can, and fired. The shot went wide, missing by several feet, and Clara let out a frustrated huff. "That's all right," Garrett said. "First shots are always off. Try again." Clara reloaded and fired again. This time the shot was closer, and on the 3rd try she managed to clip the edge of the can, sending it spinning. She let out a whoop of delight and turned to Garrett with a grin so bright it made his heart ache. "I did it. Did you see that?" "I saw," Garrett said, smiling back at her. "You are a natural." They spent the next hour practicing, and by the end of it, Clara had successfully knocked down 3 cans. She was glowing with pride, her eyes sparkling, and Garrett found himself memorizing every detail of her face, storing it away for later when she was gone, and he was alone again. "Thank you for teaching me," Clara said as they walked back toward the cabin. "I know it took time away from your work." "It was time well spent," Garrett said honestly. "You should know how to protect yourself." Clara glanced at him sideways. "You make me feel brave, Garrett, like I can do anything." "You are brave," Garrett said. "You always were. You just needed to remember it." That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara moved her chair closer to Garrett's. Not so close that they were touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence beside him. They read in companionable silence for a while, and then Clara set down her book and turned to him. "Garrett, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever get lonely up here? Living by yourself, I mean." Garrett considered the question carefully. "I used to think I preferred the solitude. After my mother died, I did not want to be around people. Everything reminded me of what I had lost. But lately," he trailed off, unsure how to continue. "Lately?" Clara prompted. "Lately I've realized that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing," Garrett said slowly. "Solitude is a choice. Loneliness is an ache. And I was lonely, even if I did not want to admit it." "And now?" Clara asked softly. Garrett looked at her gray-blue eyes reflecting the firelight, at the soft curve of her mouth, at the way she leaned toward him as though drawn by an invisible thread. "Now I'm not lonely anymore," he said quietly. "Not when you are here." Clara's breath hitched, and for a moment Garrett thought he had said too much, pushed too hard. But then she smiled, a slow, genuine smile that seemed to light up the entire cabin. "I'm not lonely either," she whispered. "Not anymore." They sat like that for a long moment, just looking at each other, and Garrett felt the world narrow to just the two of them, to the space between their chairs and the unspoken words hanging in the air. He wanted to lean over and kiss her, wanted it so badly his hands shook, but he held himself back. Clara had been through too much to be rushed. If anything was going to happen between them, it needed to be on her terms, at her pace. "I should get some rest," Clara said finally, standing up. "We have target practice again tomorrow, right?" "Right," Garrett agreed, his voice rough. Clara paused at the edge of the bed, her hand on the post. "Garrett?" "Yes?" "I'm glad I stumbled into that general store. I'm glad you were there." "So am I," Garrett said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Another week passed, and the summer heat intensified, turning the days long and golden and lazy. Garrett and Clara fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day and talking late into the evenings. Clara's shooting improved dramatically, and Garrett taught her other skills too, how to track animals, how to identify edible plants, how to start a fire without matches. She absorbed everything like a sponge, eager to learn, and Garrett loved watching her confidence grow. They were becoming something, Garrett realized. Not just two people sharing a space, but partners, a team. Clara made him laugh with her dry observations about life in the mountains, and he made her feel safe and valued in ways she had never experienced before. They moved around each other with an easy grace, anticipating each other's needs without words, and sometimes Garrett would catch Clara watching him with an expression that made his heart race. But still, neither of them spoke about what was happening between them. It was as though they had made a silent agreement to let things unfold naturally, without forcing or rushing. And truthfully, Garrett was content with that. He had Clara in his life, in his home, and that was more than he had ever expected to have. Then, on a hot afternoon in late July, everything changed. They had been down at the creek where the water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. It was too hot to work, so they had decided to cool off, and Garrett had stripped down to his pants and waded in while Clara sat on the bank with her feet in the water, her skirts hiked up to her knees. Garrett floated on his back, letting the current carry him, and listened to Clara humming a tune he did not recognize. "You should come in," he called to her. "The water feels amazing." "I do not have anything to swim in," Clara called back. "Neither do I, really," Garrett pointed out. "Just wade in a bit. You are missing out." Clara bit her lip, clearly tempted. Then, with a quick glance around as though checking for witnesses in the empty wilderness, she stood up and began unlacing her dress. Garrett immediately turned away, focusing very hard on the trees on the opposite bank, but he could hear the rustle of fabric as Clara undressed down to her chemise and drawers. "All right," she said, her voice nervous. "I'm coming in." Garrett kept his back turned until he heard her splash into the water, then he turned around and immediately wished he had not. Clara stood waist-deep in the creek, her white chemise clinging to her body and revealing every curve, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked like something out of a painting, beautiful and ethereal, and completely unaware of the effect she was having on him. "This feels wonderful," Clara said, tipping her head back and closing her eyes. "I cannot remember the last time I felt this free." Garrett tried to respond but found his throat had gone dry. He watched as Clara waded deeper, the water rising to her chest, and he forced himself to look away before his thoughts could stray any further. This was Clara, who trusted him, who had come to him for protection. He would not dishonor that trust by ogling her like some kind of animal. But then Clara laughed, a bright, joyful sound, and dove under the water. She came up sputtering and grinning, and Garrett could not help but smile back at her. She looked so happy, so free of the fear that had haunted her when they first met, and seeing her like this filled Garrett with a fierce protective pride. They played in the water like children for a while, splashing each other and laughing, and for a brief time they were not a traumatized woman and the man protecting her. They were just Garrett and Clara, two people enjoying a summer afternoon. Eventually they climbed out of the creek and lay on the warm rocks to dry off. Garrett kept a respectable distance, but he was acutely aware of Clara beside him, of the way her wet hair clung to her neck, of the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. "Garrett?" Clara said after a long silence. "Yes? I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. He sat up slowly, turning to look at Clara, certain he must have misheard. But she was looking right at him, her gray-blue eyes steady and serious, and there was no mistaking what she had said. "Clara," he started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said. "I know this is not the right time. I know I'm supposed to be healing and finding myself and all those other things, and I know you probably do not feel the same way. But I needed to tell you because I cannot keep it inside anymore. These past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You make me feel safe and strong and beautiful, even when I am covered in dirt and wearing your old shirts. And I think I could build a life here with you if you wanted that. But if you do not, if this is just about helping someone in need, then tell me now and I will leave. I will go to Helena or Missoula and start over, and I will never burden you with these feelings again." Garrett stared at her, his mind reeling. Clara loved him. Clara, this beautiful, brave, incredible woman, loved him. And she thought he might not feel the same way. She thought he was just being charitable. "Clara," he said again, and this time his voice was steady. "I have been in love with you since the moment you stumbled into that general store with fear in your eyes and steel in your spine. I did not bring you here just to help you. I brought you here because one look at you and I knew my life would never be the same. I have spent the past month trying not to fall deeper, trying to give you space to heal, but it has been like trying to hold back the tide. So yes, I want you to stay. I want you to build a life here with me. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to teach you to shoot and read books by the fire and grow old together in this cabin. I want everything, Clara. I want it all if you will have me." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, a radiant smile that seemed to contain all the joy in the world. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will have you." Then she was moving toward him, and Garrett was reaching for her. And suddenly, she was in his arms, and he was kissing her like a drowning man gasping for air. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his wet hair, her body pressed against his. She tasted like creek water, and sunshine, and promise, and Garrett knew in that moment that he would never let her go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara laughed and pressed her forehead against his. "I was so afraid you would reject me." "Never," Garrett said fiercely. "I could never reject you." They stayed by the creek for the rest of the afternoon, talking and kissing and making plans for their future. Clara would stay at the cabin, and they would figure out the rest together. Maybe they would get married, make it official. Maybe they would expand the cabin, add a room or two. Maybe they would even have children someday, a thought that made Garrett's chest swell with unexpected longing. "I want to marry you," Clara said as the sun began to set. "Not because society says I should, but because I want everyone to know that I chose you, that we chose each other." "Then we will get married," Garrett said simply. "We can ride down to Silver Creek next week, find a preacher. It does not have to be fancy." "I do not want fancy," Clara said. "I just want you." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, Garrett did not insist she take the bed while he slept by the fire. They lay down together, still fully clothed but wrapped in each other's arms, and Garrett fell asleep with Clara's head on his chest and her hand over his heart. When he woke the next morning, Clara was still there, still real, and Garrett knew that the solitary life he had built in these mountains was over, but he did not mourn it. Instead, he felt a sense of rightness, of completion, as though all the pieces of his life had finally clicked into place. They spent the next few days in a haze of happiness, stealing kisses while they worked and sitting close together in the evenings. Garrett had never been a particularly demonstrative man, but with Clara, he found he could not keep his hands to himself. He loved touching her, holding her, feeling the reality of her presence beside him. True to his word, Garrett took Clara down to Silver Creek a week later. They rode together on Smoke, Clara seated in front of Garrett with his arms around her, and they talked about everything and nothing as the miles passed beneath them. Silver Creek was bustling when they arrived, full of miners and cowboys and families going about their business. Garrett led Clara straight to the church, a simple white building at the edge of town, and knocked on the door of the attached rectory. Reverend Martin answered, a kindly older man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a ready smile. He did not ask many questions, just listened as Garrett explained that he and Clara wanted to be married, and then he nodded and invited them inside. "I will need a witness or two," Reverend Martin said. "Do you have anyone in mind?" Garrett thought for a moment, then led Clara to the general store. Samuel Thornton was delighted to see them, and even more delighted when he learned about the impending wedding. "I knew it," Samuel crowed, slapping Garrett on the back. "I knew that girl was special. Congratulations, Hayes." Samuel and his wife Martha served as witnesses, and within an hour Garrett and Clara were standing before Reverend Martin, exchanging simple vows. Garrett had no ring to offer, but Clara did not seem to care. She spoke her promises with tears streaming down her face, and when Reverend Martin pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with all the love and hope and fierce protection he felt. They stayed in town that night, renting a room at the boarding house, and for the first time, Garrett and Clara came together as husband and wife. Garrett had been with women before, but never like this, never with this depth of feeling and connection. Clara was shy at first, nervous after years with a cruel husband, but Garrett was patient and gentle, and by the end of the night, Clara was clinging to him and whispering his name like a prayer. "I love you," she said as they lay tangled together in the darkness. "I love you so much, Garrett." "I love you too," Garrett replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Forever, Clara, I promise." They returned to the cabin the next day, and life settled into a new rhythm. Clara was no longer just a guest, but Garrett's wife, and she threw herself into making the cabin a true home. She planted a small garden near the creek, growing vegetables and herbs, and she made curtains for the windows and embroidered pillowcases for the bed. Garrett built her a rocking chair and carved her name into the doorframe, a permanent mark of her place in his life. As summer turned to fall, Clara began to show signs of pregnancy. She was sick in the mornings and tired in the evenings, but she was also glowing with happiness. Garrett was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, pacing the cabin at night and making elaborate plans for the baby's arrival. "What if something goes wrong?" he asked one evening, his fear finally bubbling over. "We are so far from town, from a doctor. What if you need help and I cannot provide it?" Clara took his hand and pressed it against her still flat stomach. "Nothing is going to go wrong. Women have been having babies in remote places for thousands of years, and you will be with me. That is all I need." Garrett wanted to believe her, but the fear remained. So he rode down to Silver Creek and bought every medical text he could find, studying them by lamplight until he knew everything there was to know about childbirth. He stocked up on supplies, clean linens and medicine, and anything else he thought they might need. And he prayed, something he had not done in years, asking whatever higher power existed to keep Clara and the baby safe. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in thick white curtains by late October. Garrett and Clara spent the long dark evenings by the fire, reading and talking and planning for their future. Clara knitted tiny clothes for the baby, her needles clicking rhythmically, while Garrett whittled a cradle from pine wood. They talked about names, about how they would raise their child, about all the ways they would make sure their son or daughter knew they were loved. "I want our children to grow up free," Clara said one night, free to be themselves, to chase their dreams, to never feel trapped the way I was. They will be, Garrett promised. I swear it. The baby came in March, during a late winter storm that dumped 3 feet of snow on the mountains. Clara's labor started in the middle of the night, and Garrett woke to find her gripping his arm, her face pale but determined. "It is time," she said simply. Garrett had never been so scared in his life, but he pushed the fear down and focused on what needed to be done. He built up the fire until the cabin was warm, boiled water, laid out clean linens, and then he held Clara's hand as the contractions came, one after another. Clara was incredibly strong, barely crying out, even when Garrett knew the pain must have been unbearable. She focused on her breathing, on the simple act of bringing their child into the world, and Garrett had never loved her more than he did in those hours. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, the baby arrived. A boy, healthy and squalling, with a thick head of dark hair and his mother's gray-blue eyes. Garrett cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped the baby in a soft blanket Clara had made, then placed him in his wife's arms. "He is perfect," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Garrett, he is absolutely perfect." Garrett could not speak. He just knelt beside the bed, one hand on Clara's shoulder and the other touching the baby's tiny fingers, and felt his heart expand to a size he had not known was possible. They named him Daniel, after Garrett's father's father, a good man who had died before Garrett was born. Daniel Hayes, born in a mountain cabin during a snowstorm, with the whole world waiting for him. The first few months were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and constant worry, but they were also filled with joy, with the sound of Daniel's laughter and the sight of Clara singing to him, and the feel of his tiny hand gripping Garrett's finger. Garrett had never imagined he could love anything as much as he loved his son, and watching Clara with the baby, seeing her blossom into motherhood, only deepened his love for her. As Daniel grew, so did their family. Clara became pregnant again when Daniel was just over a year old, and this time she gave birth to a daughter, Emily, in the heat of July. Emily was quieter than her brother, content to observe the world with wide eyes, and she had her father's dark hair and her mother's smile. Garrett expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms so the children would have space to grow. He built a larger barn and bought more livestock, chickens and a cow and a pair of pigs. Clara's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables through the summer and preserved goods for the winter. They were building a life, brick by brick and day by day, and it was everything Garrett had never known he wanted. The children grew quickly, as children do. Daniel was adventurous and bold, always climbing trees and exploring the forest, while Emily was thoughtful and gentle, content to sit with her mother and learn to read. Garrett taught them both everything he knew, how to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness, how to read and write and think critically. Clara taught them kindness and compassion, how to see beauty in small things, how to build a home filled with love rather than fear. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children. Daniel's first successful hunt, Emily's first poem, birthdays and holidays, celebrated with simple gifts and abundant laughter. Thomas Hendricks was never seen again, and eventually Clara stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped expecting him to appear out of nowhere. She was free, truly free, and she bloomed in that freedom like a flower in sunlight. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett and Clara stood on the porch of their cabin, watching as Daniel and Emily played in the clearing. Daniel was 11 now, tall and strong like his father, while Emily was 9, with her mother's grace and her father's quiet strength. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Clara asked, leaning against Garrett's chest. "Some days it feels like just yesterday you stumbled into that general store," Garrett said, wrapping his arms around her. "Other days it feels like you have always been here." "I wish I had been," Clara said softly. "I wish I had met you first, before everything else." "We met when we were supposed to meet," Garrett said, "and every day since has been a gift." Clara turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and sweet. "I love you, Garrett Hayes. Thank you for saving me." "You saved me too," Garrett said, and he meant it. "I was just existing before you came along, You taught me how to live." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while their children played and the mountains rose up around them, eternal and unchanging. This was their life now, built from nothing but determination and love and the simple decision to choose each other every single day. It was not always easy. There were hard winters and lean times, sickness and worry, and all the challenges that came with raising a family in the wilderness. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. As the years continued to pass, the cabin became a true homestead. Garrett and Clara added more rooms as their family grew, because Clara became pregnant twice more, giving them 2 more sons, James and Thomas. Clara had wanted to name their youngest Thomas not after her former husband, but to reclaim the name, to give it new meaning. Garrett had been hesitant at first, but Clara insisted, and eventually he agreed. Their Thomas would be nothing like the man who had hurt Clara. He would be kind and gentle, raised with love and respect. The children grew into fine young adults, each with their own strengths and personalities. Daniel became a skilled trapper like his father, spending months at a time in the high country but always returning home. Emily married a kind schoolteacher from Silver Creek and moved to town, where she opened a small library and taught children to read. James became a rancher, buying land in the valley below the cabin and building his own homestead. And young Thomas, the baby of the family, became a doctor, traveling to San Francisco to study medicine before returning to Montana to serve the communities scattered across the territory. Garrett and Clara grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminished. They still sat by the fire in the evenings, still held hands when they walked down to the creek, still kissed each other good morning and good night. They were grandparents now, with Daniel and James both married and starting families of their own, and they loved nothing more than when all their children and grandchildren came to visit, filling the cabin with noise and laughter and life. On a warm summer evening, when Garrett was 63 and Clara was 58, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. They had been married for 35 years, and Garrett could still remember every detail of the day Clara had stumbled into his life. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked suddenly. "Giving up your solitary life for all this chaos?" Garrett looked at her, at the lines on her face that told the story of their years together, at her gray-blue eyes that still sparkled with the same spirit he had fallen in love with. "Not for a single second," he said. "You and our family are the best things that ever happened to me. I was not living before you came along. I was just surviving." "I feel the same way," Clara said, taking his hand. "You gave me a life I never thought possible. You gave me safety and love and a family. You gave me everything." "We gave it to each other," Garrett corrected gently. "That is how it works." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear. Inside the cabin, they could hear the sounds of their grandchildren laughing, Daniel's 3 children who were visiting for the week. Tomorrow morning, Garrett would take them fishing in the creek, and Clara would teach them to bake bread, and they would fill another day with memories and love. "I carried 50-pound sacks of grain all that morning," Garrett said suddenly, and Clara looked at him in surprise. "The day we met. I had been hauling grain for Samuel Thornton since dawn, and my back was aching and I was tired. I was planning to ride back up to the cabin and spend the rest of the day alone. And then you came through that door and everything changed. And then you carried me," Clara said softly. "You swept me up onto that horse and carried me away from everything that was hurting me. You carried me right to this new life." "Best decision I ever made," Garrett said. "Best decision we ever made," Clara corrected, echoing his words from a moment before. Garrett smiled and pulled Clara closer, and they sat together on the porch of the cabin they had built, surrounded by the mountains and the stars and the love they had created together. Their story had started with fear and desperation, with a woman running and a man willing to help. But it had become so much more than that. It had become a love story, a family story, a story of 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. And as they sat there together, growing old in the place they had made their home, Garrett knew with absolute certainty that he would do it all again. He would carry those sacks of grain, and then he would carry Clara away from danger, and then he would spend the rest of his life carrying her in his heart. because that was what love was. It was the choice to keep carrying, keep protecting, keep showing up day after day and year after year. The moon rose over the mountains, full and bright, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. But Garrett and Clara were not afraid. They were home, they were together, and they were exactly where they belonged. Years later, when Garrett's hair had gone completely white and his strong body had finally begun to slow with age, he still carried firewood for Clara every morning. His muscles, though not what they once were, remained capable, a testament to a lifetime of hard work. Clara would watch him from the window, this man who had saved her and loved her and built a life with her, and her heart would still skip a beat. "You do not have to do that anymore," she would tell him. "Daniel or James can bring wood when they visit." "I want to," Garrett would reply, kissing her forehead. "I will carry for you as long as I am able." And he did, right up until the end. Garrett Hayes died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, with Clara's hand in his and their children and grandchildren gathered around. He had lived a long, full life, rich with love and purpose, and when he closed his eyes for the last time, he was smiling. Clara lived another 8 years after Garrett's death, cared for by her children who refused to let her live alone. She spent her days reading the books Garrett had loved, tending the garden they had planted together, and telling stories about the mountain man who had carried her away from danger and straight into love. When Clara finally joined Garrett, her family buried them together on the hillside above the cabin, beneath the pine trees they had loved. The grandchildren carved a simple marker that read, "Garrett and Clara Hayes. They chose each other. They built a life. They loved well." And in the years that followed, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit that hillside and remember the story of how it all began. How a frightened woman had burst into a general store, and how a strong, kind mountain man had decided to help her. How he had carried sacks of grain all morning, and then how he had carried her right to a new life, right to the bed where they would sleep together for decades, right to the family and love and home they would build together. It was a simple story, really, but it was also extraordinary, because it was theirs. And every person who heard it would remember that love was not just a feeling, but a choice to protect, to carry, to show up every day and build something beautiful together. The cabin still stood in the mountains, maintained by Garrett and Clara's descendants, a testament to what two people could create when they found each other at exactly the right moment. And on quiet summer evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the creek bubbled over the rocks, people said you could still feel the love that had filled that place, as present and real as the mountains themselves. That was the legacy of Garrett and Clara Hayes. Not wealth or fame, but love. Deep, abiding, transformative love that had started with an act of courage and grown into something that would last long after they were gone. And somewhere, in whatever came after, Garrett and Clara were together still, his arms around her, her head on his chest, exactly as they were always meant to be. The end.